I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but dealing with Venezuela, Iran, the United States, and therefore global politics, and the delicate poise at which we now stand between direct United States military involvement in Venezuela, maybe even in Iran, and how the world is and should be reacting to that. The proximate cause of the debate is the threats made by the United States government repeatedly to intervene to stop the perfectly legal trade between Iran and Venezuela in petrochemical and oil supplies, which has absolutely nothing to do with the United States, but the United States has arrogated to itself the role of the world's policeman, although they won't go into a court at The Hague when the ICC begins to investigate alleged war crimes carried out by United States forces in Afghanistan. A policeman that won't go into court, indeed threatens condign punishment against that court and its officials for daring to question United States behaviour. The whole picture could not more clearly demonstrate the absolute immorality of the role of the United States in the world. An international bully, not an international policeman. But it is still, for this moment at least, might not last long, the international hegemon, arrogating to itself the right to dictate what sovereign governments do together or on their own. So I'm joined, as always, by a group of distinguished experts. I'm just the enthusiastic amateur in this picture. Let me introduce them to you. Calvin Tucker of the Morning Star newspaper is a significant figure in his own right. But here, as one of 200 international observers at Venezuela's democratic elections, has a particular expertise to bring together. William Mora, on my right, is a prominent supporter of the Venezuelan government, a prominent supporter of the late President Hugo Chavez. That's when I met him. And he flies the flag here in Britain for the Bolivarian Revolution, the theme or the ideology behind the government in Caracas. And on my far right, if you'll forgive me using that phrase, no political pun intended, is Clive Menzies, a businessman experienced in the finance sector and across technology. Clive, let me begin with you. These sanctions that the United States has levied against Venezuela and against Iran have no international legal validity. So how come the United States gets to unilaterally impose sanctions, and particularly against two countries, both of them under sanctions, but seeking to trade perfectly legally together?
Well, I draw a lot of my analysis on the work we did at Critical Thinking, which was a collaborative project to try and understand the way the world works. And when you understand the framework within which we all live, then you begin to see that the US of itself is not in control, but is effectively controlled by the structure of the political economy, and most significantly through money power. And you talk about the arbitrary sanctions of the US, I would also point to the Bank of England arbitrarily or unilaterally denying Venezuela its gold. It's sitting on $2 million worth of gold, which the Venezuelans quite legitimately asked for it to be returned, and that was refused. So what we're talking about is an overarching power structure primarily driven through the power of money, and the US is driven by money power or controlled by money power. It's the structural incentives and penalties within the political economy which create these tensions. So no, the US has no legitimacy. It's quite interesting. You made the contrast between the US being the world's policeman and the world's bully. But when we look at militarization of police forces generally, I would say there is very little difference between the two.
Point. I used to regularly be invited to debates in academic circles with, if you like, bourgeois thinkers on the subject of the rules-based order. It was a buzz phrase for quite some time. Seems ridiculous now, but a lot of people used to profess adherence, loyalty to a rules-based order. But what the US is involved in against Iran and against Venezuela is the very opposite of a rules-based order. They've actually ripped up all the rules and applied their own unilateral diktat, haven't they?
Well, I would say that they're working to a different set of rules. The rules-based order is based on the shock doctrine, which is basically to confiscate all assets that rightfully belong to the people and then rent them back to them. And that's how the Bolivian government of Evo Morales came to power, sadly no longer in existence. And if you look at what's happened progressively across Latin America, the Middle East was something of a distraction from 9/11 onwards because it kept the focus on the Middle East. In that time, you saw the genesis of some real grassroots, I hate to use that word because it's manipulated, but from the bottom up under Hugo Chavez, you had this surge of people power that actually started to control its own destiny and fostering similar movements in Ecuador, in Bolivia, and in Argentina. All that has now been swept away, and Venezuela is the last standout, if you like, as is Iran in the Middle East, along with Syria, where obviously the US hegemony and imperial ambition has been thwarted. But it
hasn't gone away, though.
It hasn't gone away, and I think that what we're seeing actually, because this has a context of the global financial system, and that is currently being deliberately collapsed. And within that context, what we're looking at in terms of America is it's in its final throes as an empire. And these, to some extent, are the last gasps of imperial ambition. Now, whether that will be subsumed into a world government, which is the primary plan, or whether the baton will be passed to possibly Israel or China, who knows? But they are all controlled by money power, so that isn't actually going to change anything much.
I'm surprised you think there's a plan. It doesn't look very much like a plan to me, but we'll come back to that. Calvin, as you look today at the state of the United States, at the absolute chaos that exists in the United States, does it surprise even a veteran anti-imperialist as you that they're still getting involved in Iran and Venezuela and between the two?
Well, I think if you look at what's happening today right across every state within the US, you can see an ideology of white supremacism, or at least the echoes of white supremacism, rooted way back in the actual formation of the United States, a country that was put together on the basis of the extermination of the indigenous population and was made economically powerful by the transportation and enslavement of black people from Africa. So you have at the moment this big groundswell, this upsurge of global anguish, global anger at what happened to the gentleman in Minneapolis.
George Floyd.
George Floyd. But of course, it's not really about George Floyd, the man. What's happened is that his killing has resonated with black people and their allies right across the world, including in countries in quite unexpected ways, parts of Eastern Europe, here in Britain, in rural Welsh villages and towns, you have Black Lives Matter protesters coming out onto the streets. So the current state of US imperialism is deeply rooted in historical events, and of course it's ideological, it's political, it's economic, and it's military. I mean, the movement of the Iranian tankers into Venezuela, the US said it was going to stop that from happening. It failed to achieve that, and they really had a bloody nose over that. But I think the military power of the United States continues essentially unabated, but within the context of a declining economic empire, as was previously stated. So a very dangerous situation.
It is because a wounded animal is famously more dangerous, and no one would look at the United States today and conclude other than this is a wounded country. You wonder, though, a political class that can't keep order in its own streets except by the use of extreme violence, which begets still more resistance, still imagining that it can control the streets of Venezuela.
Well, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, ever since the attempt to install Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela about 18 months ago, 18 months on, Guaido does not control a single hospital, a single civil servant, a single policeman, a single army unit, absolutely no aspects of the Venezuelan state. And yet that individual is recognised as the lawful president of the country by about 50 countries worldwide. These countries call themselves the international community. Of course, that's ludicrous. There's 200 countries in the world, which means 150 countries recognise the legitimate, elected president of Venezuela. Yet that does not stop this absolutely appalling sanctions regime affecting every aspect of the Venezuelan economy. And people don't know this, but those sanctions weren't actually brought in by Trump. They began in 2015 under Obama. And it was only later that Trump intensified those sanctions to cover, to seize the Citgo oil assets in the United States, to prevent Venezuela from trading, to attack all financial transactions and so forth.
Let's hear from Dr. Francisco Dominguez. He's the head of Center for Brazilian and Latin American Studies at Middlesex University. Dr. Francisco, did the success of the Iranian flotilla arriving with the fuel in Venezuela pose a threat to US hegemony?
Not only you have two countries that have been heavily sanctioned by the United States with, the intention to asphyxiate them economically, with the intention of making the pariahs of the world, even with constant threats of military action against them, both in the case of Iran as well as in the case of Venezuela. And the government of Iran has taken the decision, obviously in collaboration with the Venezuelan government, to actually send this flotilla. Not only the United States was desperate to try to do something about it and eventually decided not to do it. In fact, the United States has deployed a huge war flotilla in the Caribbean with the ostensible intention to stop drug trafficking from Venezuela, as they claim, falsely, of course, and which has got the collaboration of warships from France, from the Netherlands, and the UK. This involved warships, helicopters, warplanes, submarines, God knows what. And they were right in the vicinity, and one after another of these tankers just went through. And more important, that this was revealed by the Venezuelan government itself, the military escorts that escorted the various tankers one after another went outside the special economic zone of Venezuela, that is to say, went into international waters to make sure that they were ready to offer any protection were the United States to attack, and they went in. Now, this doesn't end the blockade against Venezuela, but it massively dents it, But more important that in terms of the specifics of the blockade itself, economically, financially, and so on, energetically speaking, I think the most important significance is symbolic. The inability and paralysis of the United States, the world's most radical right-wing government ever, after threatening repeatedly, they ended up doing literally nothing. And I think that's a huge blow, and it offers possibilities for many countries around the world. And it's going to change the world quite dramatically because it's likely to happen again and again and again, not necessarily only between Venezuela and Iran, but I'm sure between Venezuela and others, Iran and others, and many other countries and others, because it's totally unacceptable. The United States uses extraterritorial military threat to impose its illegal will and criminal will on countries that all they want to do is trade and collaborate peacefully.
William, it's your country. You must have been, in terms of your morale, greatly lifted by the failure of the United States to stop the legal trade between Iran and Venezuela. But they haven't gone away, have they? United States soldiers have been arriving in next door Colombia. The sanctions have been intensified, the rhetoric ramped up. How do you see the current situation between US imperialism and your country?
This is a long battle we have with the United States since the beginning of the revolution in 1999. At the moment we announced our constitution, the shape of the constitution was challenging the dogma of the United States. The way how the constitution established the distribution of power to the people and create the need to create structures at the grassroots to start taking decisions by their own, community-based. President Chavez then moved into modifying the economy system and regain sovereignty on the oil industry. And that was the nerve that touched the empire. When we declared that the oil belongs to Venezuela, immediately we moved the Venezuelan reserve out of the ExxonMobil books into Venezuelan books. ExxonMobil used to lend money using Venezuelan reserve as their own. When we declared that, ExxonMobil declared that they are having losses, and with ExxonMobil, all the corporations inside the United States. The rhetoric we are seeing lately is just a projection of their battle that started in 1999 and then 2001 when President Chavez announced the new laws that enforce the Constitution and then propagate forward the movement, the movement of the project. Immediately the United States start having reactions, violent reactions against Venezuela political structures. The coup d'etat in 2002, then the military invasion of mercenaries in 2003, the oil strike in 2003, and then consecutive manipulations and using the Venezuelan opposition as a puppet of the United States interests. And slowly, the Venezuelan opposition has been decanted into a very violent, dominant force in the Venezuelan spectrum that silence the moderate voices that can make the protagonism of the democracy in Venezuela. So Venezuela has been left with a very violent opposition, supported financially, logistically, politically, and in the media by the United States and its allies, and has been carried on up to the point that we have a puppet president selected by the United States that hasn't never concurred to the elections of the mass of the population, has nobody elected him as a president. He has no mandate to do anything, but the mandate has been instructed to him by the United States. Juan Guaidó is asking for the most horrendous things against his own country, without the understanding that he is naked in front of all of us. Everybody will remember him. Everybody will not forget what he's doing right now. Even he has the backing of very big bullies. These bullies will not stay there forever. I hope we will peacefully overcome this resistance that we're having now with the Venezuelan opposition. We peacefully will get to the next election, and peacefully we will demobilize the far-right violent leadership that the United States has imposed into the Venezuelan opposition to one side. and we will have a moderate, constructive opposition that is loyal to the country, and we will be able to transit to the next stage. But now the detail is this. United States is not having it. Venezuela is in such a critical moment that the United States has to invade Venezuela. It's done if don't invade it, and it's done if they invade it. So the United States has trapped himself into an impossible position. And I am afraid they will launch the attack on Venezuela because they need it. Because it's a projection of the domestic policy, because they need to show internally, domestically, that they are strong. And they need a victory somewhere. And they think there will be an easy victory in Venezuela. And they will not.
So, Doctor, why did the US fail on this occasion to stop this trade between Iran and Venezuela?
I wish I knew definitely what the reason was, but I think there are several reasons that must come into the picture for us to understand why they didn't. Number one, even though the Pentagon, are very warmonger themselves, and they're the ones that implement the policy of the United States everywhere, and they've been doing it for decades, I think many of them came to the conclusion, and I think there are reasonable people there who knows what the realities of the situation in the world are. They possibly advise against it. I mean, many of them, during the time when there was this deployment of the flotilla in the Caribbean against Venezuela, several voices, quite high up officers, went public in magazines such as Foreign Policy saying, this is not a good idea, and so on. So many voices within the Pentagon, within the military establishment, I'm sure expressed themselves saying, this is not a good idea. And were very reluctant to go for it. They said that publicly many times. But I think there is a second important factor. When the United States, in the most abject manner, prepared the ground by deceit and ended up assassinating General Soleimani, they never expected the response that they got from Iran. And in the Middle East, the United States, militarily, politically, and economically, are quite fragile, quite vulnerable to attacks. I remember reading the response by the Iranian government, which was to attack 3 US military bases with substantial force, something that never happened before. So in this particular occasion, not only the Pentagon advice and the military reluctance in the United States to go for a significant conflict, but also the possible response that they would have meted out would have been quite substantial. And I think there is a third but minor development, which is possibly the Europeans were, very worried about this sort of thing, although because they're so cowardly, they possibly expressed it very privately, making sure that they run away back to their position of security before this was noticed by anybody. So the United States realized, and certainly people who think in there, that it would be very isolated where there had to be a response by Iran, and therefore they decided to sit tight and do nothing.
Thank you, Dr. Francisco. Much more of this coming up after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen Television, coming from London, but discussing the US hegemon and its aggression, particularly against Iran and Venezuela, and even more when Iran and Venezuela begin to cooperate. Calvin, we've seen this, of course, before, those of us old enough to remember. The purpose of these sanctions and economic destabilization is to make the economy scream in the country that's being targeted, or make the people rather scream. We saw it in Chile in the run-up to the overthrow of President Allende. We've seen it in many places. But it isn't making Iran scream, and it isn't yet making Venezuela scream. Does that then lead in the direction that William thinks that it might, of having to take direct military action. I must say the prospect of this United States, this disunited States, getting involved in a major war in Venezuela, I don't think they'll dare with Iran, is a pretty frightening prospect. What do you think?
I think you're quite right. I mean, I think the United States hegemony is breaking down internally in the US. We've got the racial fault lines, the regional fault lines, economic fault lines running across every part of that country. So I think it's weakening internally. I think it's weakening economically, at least in relative terms to China. And of course, I think that lies behind why Donald Trump turned the US imperial fire from Russia and concentrated that on China. And there's been some signs from EU countries that they're now picking up on the anti-Chinese bandwagon. So yes, I think this is a dangerous, perhaps a cornered animal might be going a bit strong, but certainly this is a very dangerous animal that sees threats all around it. I mean, sanctions work for the United States in the sense that by destroying or disabling the economies of these countries, they create a level of internal turmoil that can lead to the demoralisation of ordinary people. And of course, ultimately, governments are judged by their ability to deliver what ordinary people need: homes, food, health, education, all the things that William was talking about, that the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela had such a proud record until imperialism was able to intervene both through sanctions and also by manipulating the price of oil, going back for decades, but over recent years, that's had a substantial effect on Venezuela's ability to look after its own people. I mean, the economic situation in Venezuela for ordinary people, I think, is fair to be described as dire at the moment. I mean, the reason, in my view, that they're hanging on is because they have a government committed to looking after ordinary working class and poor people in the barrios. The barrios are the popular districts where working class and poor people live, and they have a distribution, it's monthly, I think, of something called the CLAP food hamper. So this provides basic rations for ordinary Venezuelans, so people are being, by and large, fed. And they've managed to keep the education system and the health service functioning, but not functioning to the levels they were at the height of the Chavez presidency. These are functioning on a low level, but the Venezuelan people are not going to give in. If they were going to give in, they've had plenty of opportunities to wave the white flag, from oil executive strike to the 2002 military coup, the series of mini coups we've had recently, culminating in that absurd kind of historical reenactment of the Bay of Pigs when, you know, this group of mercenaries turns up on the Venezuelan coast and is apprehended by local fishermen. So no, the sanctions haven't worked. I don't believe they're going to work in the sense that they're going to topple the Venezuelan government, but they do prevent Venezuela from functioning as an ordinary society. Will the United States militarily intervene? There's a logic to them militarily intervening, but as Francisco Dominguez was saying earlier on, look at the complete lack of action when Iran launched a sustained barrage of missiles at US bases in Iraq. The US did absolutely nothing. Of course, countries can come in, the US can come in, it can bomb, it can attack, it can attempt to subjugate, but unless they're prepared to put boots on the ground, because that is what will be required to subjugate the Venezuelan people. Because my experience of travelling to the countries, there's no way on earth that the population are going to simply fall over and accept US military domination.
Let's talk about Iran. Dr. Yasmin Maidar from Oxford University, St. Anthony's College, is Iranian, a highly experienced campaigner on the issues confronting her country. Dr. Yasmin, welcome. Doctor, why do you think the US failed to intervene between the Iranians and the Venezuelans?
In my opinion, there are two elements. One is the current situation, even before the last weeks, which coincided with the travels of the flotilla, the US president was facing a major crisis. Already 100,000 people died from coronavirus. Of course, after that, he lost even more support because of his attitude towards race. But I think he has quite a lot of enemies within the United States. Former defense minister matters. So you see a situation which was unique, probably historically. There is, in addition, the threats that Iran had replied to by saying, we will not start a war, but we will retaliate should there be an attack on the flotilla. The combination, I think, has meant this policy. We have to be careful. The US is now planning sanctions on all tankers going to Venezuela and tanker companies associated with the 5 tankers. So we are at the beginning of this whole episode in some way.
Some see the failure of the United States successfully to intervene to mean a real change in the international environment. How far do you think this shake-up will go?
It really depends. I think at the current moment in history, the US president is extremely isolated, and he has made himself isolated, both internally and internationally. And that has given this opportunity. And of course, we are going to see a major economic crisis that will have long-term effects on the US economy and global economy, global capitalist economy. And therefore, there is talk of the rise of China and other international issues. Having said all that, I think the US remains the hegemon power in the world. And we have to see what happens in November. Maybe another US president will regain, if you like, the support of the international communities, the ones that Trump has lost, and position himself more within the sections of both Congress, but also the military, who will back him more.
What will Iran do now, given that they are still facing very serious economic sanctions from the US?
Well, Iran is in a very difficult position economically because of the sanctions. So it would try, as any country that is under such pressures, it would try to continue this by selling oil to other countries either openly or maybe more secretly, but it has to survive. An economy for 80 million Iranians cannot continue without selling oil. And as you know, the price of oil has dropped because of the crisis and so on. So Iran will try, and any other country in that position would have done exactly the same, will try and find ways out of it. Having said that, I think the scale of the problems that Iran is facing economically are tremendous. And these will not necessarily solve the long-term economic problems.
Is this the beginning of the end of United States hegemony in the world?
Well, the US has been in decline, and the decline is showing itself. In the election of Trump, it shows itself, and there is contradiction. But as I said before, I think economically, but also in terms of military air power, the US remains a powerful country, and there will be time before, maybe decades, a couple of decades, before another country can overtake it.
Dr. Yasmin, thank you. Clive, what options do the US have short of war to assert their hegemony, which we're all talking about? What can they do on the level of this money power that you talked about? Well, they are undoubtedly still the king.
Well, I think if one looks at the history of countries that have been sanctioned and attacked, Iraq, for example, where Madeleine Albright said it was worth 500,000 Iraqi children dying for, then if we look at what has happened through the Middle East, then that gives us some indication of what the modus operandi is. If we look at most of the world, it's in the camp of Anglo-American power or the New World Order, whatever you like to call it. The hangouts or holdouts are Iran, Syria, where they failed. And I think there's a question around US military superiority. Russia doesn't advertise its military technical capability. But I think what we've seen through the Syrian conflict is that America doesn't have it all its own way. To some extent, its military superiority is something of a myth. And if you look at the acceleration of Chinese technology in the way they build infrastructure, and if they're applying the same sort of techniques to weaponry, then I don't think it's necessarily the case that the US has unlimited military superiority or uncheckable.
Certainly not 2 decades, which was Yasmin's estimation, that they have another 20 years.
No, they have.
As the
world is
superpower.
Currently in a state of great flux. And I think that we're looking at a pivotal point in civilization as we know it. And one of the things that doesn't come into this argument directly, but is very relevant, is the structure of money and how money is controlled. And the central banks have effectively been driving the global economy. They've been bailing out the economy since 2008. It's a trick that comes to an end. So what we're talking about is the collapse of the economic system, but at the same time, there are decentralizing forces. So there is this global cartel of immune banks, but they're under challenge from other forces which are seeking to decentralize money power.
Well, China is now beginning to sell American debt. The Fed has threatened, promised, depending on your point of view, to move into negative interest territory. The dollar is under challenge in terms of its global hegemony, is it not?
Well, certainly, and I would say that goes for sterling, it goes for the euro, it goes for Japanese yen. If you continue to issue currency, it's a trick that gives a feel-good factor in the stock markets, not necessarily for the people. You know, since 2008, people have got progressively poorer and poorer. The middle classes too, not just the working classes. But those at the top, the plutocracy, which was described in a report by Citibank in 2006, basically there are 2 economies. So when you look at averages, they're meaningless because there is the economy for the rich, luxury goods and all the rest of it. And then there is the economy that most people live in. And what is happening at the moment, there is a lack of demand in the economy. So we've got opposing forces. We've got massive deflationary forces, which already began before the so-called coronavirus. But at the same time, we've got the central banks, such as the Federal Reserve, which started inflating its balance sheet, its reserves, in September 2019. And sooner or later, money is all about confidence. And when confidence goes, that's when everything falls apart. And that's why you're hearing Mark Carney, who's now moved to responsibility for climate and money, talking about a digital currency, a global digital currency related to energy. So money power has a plan, which is a global currency, but there are also decentralizing forces, self-interested forces that are doing this out of self-interest, that are actually chipping away at this concept of centralized money, which has been with us for hundreds of years.
Let's get a view from across the Atlantic from Wyatt Reed, who's in Washington, D.C. He is a D.C.-based journalist who focuses on Latin America, but he's also the producer of By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik and a frequent contributor to The Grey Zone. Wyatt, welcome to the show. How important do you think the export of Iranian fuel to Venezuela will turn out to have been?
The Venezuelan government has achieved a number of huge PR victories and, you know, not just propaganda victories, but actual victories for the working people of Venezuela. In the past few months, after foiling this bizarre, seemingly U.S.-backed, or at the very least, this attempted coup that the CIA was aware of, if nothing else, was aware of and did nothing to stop, as far as we can tell. In addition to this sort of Bay of Piglets, as it's being described, just a few months ago, we now have Iran and Venezuela cooperating together to alleviate these tremendous gas shortages. We recently spoke with Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Ariasa. He described this campaign, this fight, this battle being waged as tremendously important to the Venezuelan people, and as really sort of the first step in this new economic order that Venezuela and other non-aligned movement countries are hoping to lay out going forward. So yes, tremendously important, not just for the Venezuelan people. In addition to the gasoline, we now have crucial parts that are going to be able to repair Venezuela's oil refineries and get that sector back in motion. So important from the perspective of just allowing mobility within Venezuelan society and also getting that country's economy back up and running.
How is this being portrayed in the US? Do people know about it? What do they think about it? And might it lead to still more aggression by the United States?
Yeah, I think we see frustration, really. Frustration, anger, impotence was a great word from the Washington Post. They are not saying more because there's not much to say that isn't, we lost, this is embarrassing. So, we're seeing a move yesterday, this was reported in Bloomberg, to prepare, the Trump administration is preparing sanctions on as many as 50 oil and fuel tankers as part of an effort to cut trade between Iran and Venezuela, according to a person familiar with the matter. So unclear who exactly that is. This is Bloomberg reporting it. And sanctions, again, predictable, right? But this is kind of the point of the whole struggle that we're witnessing. The sanctions are their only recourse at this point. And they've already been proven really to not be willing to back it up with the military force that would be necessary to make this more meaningful. So they've already exposed themselves, as Mao Zedong, as a paper tiger, of an imperialist paper tiger. So you see now that there are certain actions that they cannot do, and just by failing to attack Venezuela or Iran, to aggress against them militarily for the supposed sin of daring to cooperate on matters of trade, just by not reacting to that, well, they are now opening the door to any country in the world, and there are a lot of them which face U.S. sanctions, now defying those sanctions and knowing, well, nothing happened to Venezuela, nothing happened to Iran, they slapped more sanctions on us. Well, they're already sanctioning us. You know what? We're just going to have to keep doing it and go forward and let the U.S. worry about itself.
William, Chairman Mao was definitely premature, to say the least, in the 1960s to describe the United States as a paper tiger. It's eaten a lot of people since Mao said that. If not a paper tiger, certainly an enfeebled one, a cornered one, a wounded one. Why are you so anxious that they might fancy wading ashore in your country? Wouldn't that risk another Vietnam and therefore another defeat?
They are convinced that Venezuela is an easy piece of food.
That's what they said about Iraq.
They keep telling everybody that, and they keep telling themselves because they keep, I don't know where, they keep gathering this ill intelligence. My concern is, based on that tradition of gambles and mistakes, they will launch another one because they are convinced they can quickly do it. They think, for a reason, they will be welcome with victories. And they forgot how we treat Nixon when he came to Caracas. He was pushed out. He was an embarrassment. He don't want to talk about the visit to Caracas. President Nixon. So why you want to repeat the same mistakes?
Well, look, many people are puzzled at the role of this Juan Guaido. As Calvin mentioned earlier, 50 countries in the world continue to recognize him as the president. It looked pretty stupid at the time.
It is.
It looks utterly farcical now. What do the people in the street in Venezuela think of this man, and how come he's still at liberty to walk around calling for the invasion of his own country?
We learn from our own mistakes. When the position of Juan Guaido was first occupied by Leopoldo López. And Leopoldo López launched these guarimbas, that violent protests planned well ahead, and they pretend to be spontaneous. But there were logistics arriving to Caracas from Miami. Money was donated well beforehand, before 2014. He was, in 2013, in August, doing rallies in Miami, gathering money for these guarimbas in January, February 2014. And he was made prisoner because he actually organized the killing of 43 Venezuelans. He was not a killer, but he coadjuvated to the killing. So he was charged and condemned for this death. He became an international human rights hero. And then we could understand why the media, the BBC, The Guardian, invest so much in protecting a figure like Leopoldo López and create of him as a political prisoner. No, this guy organized the killing of Venezuelans. He is a criminal. So we couldn't detangle these two. And it was impossible to offer more evidence that convinced the media to reverse the situation, because it was a political plot. So the same thing is happening with Guaido. So Guaido will be potable again, will become a political asset again if he became a prisoner. So we cannot put him in jail, unfortunately. He has all the records to be in jail long time ago. But at the moment we put him in jail, he will become, instead of a liability, became an asset again. And we don't want to give that to them. And the other thing, he's totally impotent. He cannot do anything. He's a laughable stock. So in terms of legal stuff, he should be in jail. I think he will be in jail eventually.
Last question for all of you, and very briefly, with 2020 vision, if we were to hold this program again, say in 2 years' time, will the United States have prevailed either in Iran or in Venezuela? Calvin?
It's always a risk at predicting the future, George, but I'll have a go. The answer is no in either case. I don't believe the US is likely to launch a military invasion of Iran. It may well take some military action stopping short of an invasion. The same situation applies in Venezuela, but unless the US is willing to put boots on the ground in Venezuela, it won't succeed, because if they kill Maduro, and they've tried several times, the drone attack, the recent mercenary excursion, if they kill Maduro, simply another Maduro will take his place. The Venezuelan army's 500,000 strong. It's united. If it was going to crack, it would have cracked by now. 10 times that many civilians are organised in citizens' militias. These people are highly motivated, highly politicised. They understand what the issues are, and they'll fight. If the US goes into Venezuela, there will be a catastrophic bloodbath. But even if they did, they still won't win.
Clive?
I similarly am loath to make predictions, but I'd say this is a question relating to the world rather than specifically Venezuela. The world is in a state of transition, and we're going to go through the Western world, something that we've not experienced in our lifetimes, but our parents' generations experienced, the sort of dislocation that arises from economic collapse and internal warfare. So I think if the forces of decentralization prevail, then Venezuela and many more countries will be free, all of those that have been under oppression, whether we're talking about the Kurds across the Middle East or the Palestinians. If the forces of decentralization prevail, then we're looking at a much better world for everyone, including Venezuela and Iran.
William, last word to you.
We have to embrace for impact. The situation will get very bad in some point in this year, next year. The United States is launching a massive bailout of 9 trillion into the economy and will create a massive inflation factor inside the United States. That is my perception of the crisis. So the foreign policy of the United States is a reflection of the internal policy, domestic policy. The only thing I want to say is in 2 years' time, only solidarity between nations will help us to get through. This is a massive shock wave coming. We have to embrace for impact, and we have to embrace together. So the solidarity that I see between Iran and Venezuela, I bless it. I bless it heartfully, because even in the most dramatic circumstances, with the most atrocious penalties, with more punishment in our ways, we help each other, and we want to everybody understand that regardless of the language, the religion, the pole of the planet you live, if we help each other, we will get through this together.
Fasten your seatbelts. Embrace for
impact.
It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. I've been George Galloway. This is Mayadeen Television, and you have been a wonderful audience. Thanks for watching.